Hello everyone. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is right now. That's how YouTube keeps sending you more chilling stories like this. And now, let the night begin with Story 1, The Book That Remembered Me. My hands were shaking as I flipped to the last page, and there it was. Tomorrow's date written in handwriting that perfectly matched my own. The final entry read, "I know someone will find this journal. I know they'll read every word just like I did. I've always been drawn to old books. There's something about the smell of aged paper, the weight of stories that have been read countless times by countless hands." So when I saw the donation bin outside the university library overflowing with discarded volumes, I couldn't resist taking a look. Most of it was the usual stuff: outdated textbooks, romance novels with cracked spines, self-help books from the 80s. But buried beneath a pile of chemistry manuals, I found something different. It was a leather-bound journal, unmarked except for some water stains along the edges. The kind of book that looked like it had stories to tell. I took it home that night, made myself some tea, and settled into my reading chair. The first entry was dated September 15th, 1978, written in careful cursive handwriting. "Moved into the dorms today, room 314 in Patterson Hall." It was charming, really, someone's personal account of their college years, probably from a student who'd graduated decades ago. I found myself getting lost in their daily routines, complaints about cafeteria food, excitement about weekend parties, anxiety over upcoming exams. There was something universally relatable about the college experience, even across generations. The entries continued chronologically through fall semester. The writer talked about professors I'd never heard of, classes that probably didn't exist anymore, campus events from before I was born. But then, around mid-October, something started feeling familiar. Grabbed coffee at Morrison's Corner before my 2 p.m. literature class. The barista with the red hair was there again. I knew Morrison's Corner. I went there at least 3 times a week. And there was indeed a red-haired barista who had an uncanny memory for regular customers' orders. But Morrison's had only been open for about 5 years. It definitely wasn't around in 1978. I told myself it was probably just a coincidence. Maybe there had been another coffee shop in the same location back then. Or maybe I was misremembering the timeline. I kept reading. The entries from November made my skin crawl. Walking back from the library tonight, I took the shortcut through Riverside Park. The old oak tree by the pond is starting to lose its leaves. That was my shortcut. That was my bench. I discovered that exact spot during my first semester 2 years ago, thinking I was the only one who knew about the hidden path through the park, but the journal was describing it perfectly. Down to the specific oak tree and the worn wooden bench someone had installed decades ago. I flipped ahead, my heart starting to race. The December entries mentioned street names from my neighborhood, restaurants I frequented, even the little bookstore where I worked part-time, though the journal called it by a name I'd never heard before. By January, the details were impossible to ignore. Professor Hendricks assigned another 20-page paper. I swear that man exists solely to make students miserable. At least I can work on it at the apartment. Professor Hendricks taught my Victorian literature course, and my radiator did make a clicking sound, something I'd never mentioned to anyone because it was subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice it. But somehow this journal writer from 1978 knew about my apartment's quirky heating system. I should have stopped reading. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that this was impossible. But I couldn't put the journal down. The entries were becoming more personal, more specific. The writer described conversations I'd had with friends, thoughts I'd never shared with anyone, even the exact contents of my refrigerator from the previous week. The handwriting began to change around March. The careful cursive became looser, more hurried. And slowly, so gradually I almost didn't notice, it started to look more like my own writing. The letter formations, the way certain words were spelled, even the pressure applied to the pen. I'm starting to understand what's happening. This journal isn't just recording the past, it's creating the future. My hands were trembling as I read those words. The handwriting was unmistakably my own now, though I had no memory of writing any of it. The April entries became increasingly frantic. I tried to stop writing, but I can't. Every night I sit down with this journal and the words just flow out of me. I'm writing someone else's life, describing experiences they haven't had yet, choices they haven't made, but they will. They have to. The final entries were the worst. They described my last 2 years in perfect detail. Every class, every relationship, every mundane Tuesday afternoon I'd spent doing laundry or grocery shopping. But they were written in 1978, decades before I was born. The journal writer knew my life better than I did, including moments I'd completely forgotten about until seeing them on the page. And then on the very last written page, I found an entry dated tomorrow. Today is the day I finish the story. The person reading this journal will understand now that some books choose their readers, not the other way around. Below that, in handwriting that perfectly matched my own, were the words I'd heard in my mind as I'd been reading. I know someone will find this journal. I know they'll read every word just like I did. I closed the journal and sat in my reading chair until dawn, staring at the leather cover. When morning came, I did exactly what the final entry predicted. I found a pen, opened to the next blank page, and began to write. I don't know why I'm writing this. I don't know how the journal works or who will read these words, but I can feel the story pulling me forward, demanding to be told. Tomorrow, someone else will find this journal in a donation bin. They'll take it home, thinking they've discovered an interesting piece of history. They have no idea they're about to read their own future. Story 2. The Patron in Aisle 7. I could see the shelves through his body when he looked up at me. And his expression wasn't surprise at finally being noticed. It was recognition, like he'd been waiting years for me to work up the courage to speak to him. "You can see me," he said, and his voice sounded like pages turning in an empty room. Taking the closing shift at Millfield Public Library was supposed to be easy money. 2 hours alone after the last patron left, just shelving returned books and doing basic cleanup. The pay wasn't great, but as a grad student, I needed every dollar I could get. The library closed to the public at 8 p.m., which meant I had the building to myself from 8 until 10. I actually enjoyed the quiet. During the day, the place buzzed with activity, kids running between stacks, college students claiming every table, elderly patrons lingering over newspapers, but at night it felt peaceful, almost sacred. The first few weeks went smoothly. I'd lock the front doors after the last patron left, then spend my time reshelving books and wiping down tables. The work was meditative, and I often found myself browsing titles as I worked, sometimes checking out books to take home. It was during my 4th week that I first noticed him. He was standing in the reference section, aisle 7, reading what appeared to be a thick historical volume. Tall, maybe mid-40s, wearing a dark coat that looked expensive but outdated. I glanced at the clock and realized it was already 8:15. Somehow I'd missed him during my closing routine. "Excuse me," I called out, walking toward the reference section. "The library's closed." He didn't respond, didn't even look up from his book. I moved closer, my footsteps echoing in the empty building. "Sir?" Still nothing. As I approached aisle 7, I could hear the soft sound of pages turning, but when I rounded the corner, the aisle was empty. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe the stress of grad school was getting to me more than I'd realized. 2 nights later, he was there again. Same spot, same dark coat, same thick book. This time I was sure I'd checked every aisle during closing. I even kept mental notes of the last few patrons who'd left, and I distinctly remembered watching the final person, an elderly woman with a stack of romance novels, walk out the front door at 7:55. I said, approaching more cautiously this time, "The library is closed." He turned a page, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent building. I was maybe 10 feet away now, close enough to see that he was reading something about local history, 19th century records of some kind. But I still couldn't make out his features clearly. The overhead lighting in the reference section cast strange shadows, making everything look slightly out of focus. That got his attention. He looked up from the book, and for just a moment, I could swear I saw the shelves behind him through his body, like he was somehow translucent, but then he moved slightly and the effect disappeared. "Of course," he said, his voice soft and apologetic. He closed the book and walked past me toward the front of the library. I followed at a distance, watching as he headed for the exit. But when I rounded the corner to check the circulation desk, the front area was empty. The doors were still locked from the inside, exactly as I'd left them. I spent the next 20 minutes searching every corner of the building. Storage rooms, bathrooms, the staff break room. Everywhere. Nothing. It was like he'd simply vanished into thin air. The incidents continued every few nights. Always the same. I'd notice him in aisle 7 after closing, always reading the same thick volume. Sometimes I'd try to approach him directly. Other times I'd watch from a distance. His behavior never varied. He'd stand there turning pages with mechanical precision, completely absorbed in whatever he was reading. What disturbed me most was that he never seemed to start the book over. Every time I saw him, he appeared to be on a different page, as if he was reading straight through from beginning to end across multiple visits. But the book looked enormous, easily 600 or 700 pages. How long could one person take to read a single volume? After 3 weeks of these encounters, I decided to investigate. During my next day shift, I went to aisle 7 to see what books were actually shelved there. The reference section contained local history materials, genealogical records, old city directories, and archived newspapers dating back to the 1800s. Most of the volumes were bound collections, thick and heavy, just like what I'd seen him reading. I pulled several books from the shelf where I'd always seen him standing. City records from 1890 to 1910, property deeds and business licenses, birth and death certificates, the kind of dry, archival material that only researchers and genealogy enthusiasts typically accessed. One book caught my attention, a bound collection of newspaper obituaries from 1952 to 1961. It was exactly the size and color of the volume I'd seen him reading. I flipped through it randomly, not sure what I was looking for. That's when I found it. On page 347, dated October 15, 1959, Harold Mitchell, 43, died unexpectedly at Millfield Public Library while conducting research for his family history project. Mr. Mitchell was found by library staff during their closing routine, seated at a table in the reference section. Preliminary investigation suggests natural causes, though the exact cause of death has not been determined. The photograph accompanying the obituary was grainy and small, but the facial features were unmistakable. Dark hair, angular face, serious expression. It was him. The man I'd been seeing in aisle 7 was Harold Mitchell, and he'd been dead for over 60 years. I stared at the obituary for several minutes, my hands shaking slightly. This had to be a coincidence. Maybe I'd seen this photo before without remembering it, and my subconscious had created a false memory. Maybe the stress of grad school was causing some kind of psychological break. but deep down I knew what I'd been seeing was real. That night I decided to confront him directly. When 8 o'clock came, I locked the front doors and immediately headed for aisle 7. He was there, as I'd known he would be, reading his book with the same focused concentration I'd observed dozens of times before. "Harold," I said quietly. He looked up immediately, and this time there was no mistaking what I saw. The shelves behind him were clearly visible through his body. He was translucent, like an old photograph projected onto smoke. "You can see me," he said, and his voice sounded like pages turning in an empty room. "You're Harold Mitchell." He nodded slowly. "I was researching my family history, trying to trace my grandfather's immigration records." He gestured to the book in his hands. "Is that why you're still here?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "I just know that when evening comes, I find myself back here reading. Always reading. The same records, the same names, the same dates." We stood there in silence for a moment. I could hear the building's heating system humming softly, the distant sound of traffic from the street outside. Normal sounds from a normal world that suddenly felt very far away. I asked, "I can't. When the library closes each night, I'm still here. When it opens each morning, I'm gone." "What about other people?" Harold shook his head. "You're the first person who's noticed me in all these years." I wanted to help him, but I had no idea how. What do you say to a man who's been trapped in the same routine for over 60 years? How do you help someone solve a mystery they've been working on since before you were born? "Maybe I could help you find what you're looking for," I offered. "I have access to digital records now, online databases." He smiled sadly. "That's very kind, but I don't think this is about the research anymore." Over the following weeks, I began staying later, talking with Harold during my closing shifts. He told me about his life, his family, the Millfield of the 1950s. In return, I told him about the modern world, how the library had changed, how research was conducted now. But no matter what we discussed, he always returned to his book when our conversations ended. Always the same page-turning ritual, always the same focused concentration. It was as if he was compelled to continue reading, even though he knew he'd never reach the end. I started researching Harold's death, hoping to find some clue that might help him move on. But the records were sparse. He'd simply been found dead at a library table, apparently of natural causes. No family members were interviewed. No suspicious circumstances were noted. The truth is, I don't know how to help him. And after 2 months of our nightly conversations, I'm not sure he wants to be helped. Maybe some people are meant to stay where they belong, even after death. Maybe the library is Harold's home now, just as it was when he was alive. What I do know is that I've stopped being afraid of him. When I see him standing in aisle 7 reading his eternal book, I just nod and go about my work. Sometimes we talk, sometimes we don't, but there's a strange comfort in knowing I'm not really alone during those quiet closing hours. I still work the evening shift at Millfield Public Library. I still lock the doors at 8 p.m. and spend 2 hours alone with the books and the silence. But I'm not really alone, and I never will be. Every night, Harold Mitchell continues his research in aisle 7, turning pages in a book he'll never finish, searching for answers to questions he's forgotten how to ask. Story 3. Something lived in the rare books room. I found the nest on a Tuesday morning tucked behind a shelf of 17th century religious texts. It was made of shredded paper and bookbinding, and scattered around it were hundreds of pages covered in careful handwritten notes. Someone, or something, had been reading these priceless books for decades, learning from them, copying passages in handwriting that grew more sophisticated with each page. And the most recent notes were dated just 3 days ago. Getting the graduate assistant position in the university's rare books collection felt like winning the lottery. The pay was decent, the work was interesting, and I got to spend my days surrounded by some of the most valuable books in the world. Manuscripts dating back to the 15th century, first editions worth more than my car, documents that historians would kill to access. The rare books room was located in the basement of the main library, behind 2 sets of security doors and a climate control system that maintained perfect temperature and humidity year-round. Access was strictly limited. Myself, Dr. Patterson, who ran the collection, and maybe a dozen approved researchers who had to schedule visits weeks in advance. My job was straightforward: catalog new acquisitions, monitor environmental conditions, and ensure that every book was properly maintained and correctly shelved. It was solitary work, which suited me fine. I could spend hours lost in the careful process of examining bindings, updating inventory records, and occasionally reading passages from books that predated the printing press. For the first month, everything went smoothly. I developed a routine: arrive at 9 a.m., check the environmental monitors, review any access requests for the day, and work through my cataloging assignments. The room was always exactly as I'd left it the previous day. Every book in its designated spot, every environmental reading within normal parameters. The first sign something was wrong came on a Thursday morning in October. I arrived to find 3 books reshelved in the wrong locations. Not randomly misplaced, deliberately moved to different sections entirely. A 16th century treatise on astronomy had been placed among the medieval poetry. A collection of Renaissance letters was sitting with the religious manuscripts. A first edition Darwin was nestled between 2 volumes of ancient Greek philosophy. I assumed Dr. Patterson had been working late and had simply made some filing errors. It happened occasionally, especially when he was rushing to prepare materials for visiting researchers. I reshelved the books correctly and made a mental note to mention it to him later. But the next morning I found 5 more books out of place, and the morning after that, 7 more. Always deliberately repositioned, never randomly scattered. Someone was definitely accessing the collection after hours, but the security logs showed no entry records. The room's keycard reader would have recorded any access, and the digital locks required both a valid card and a numeric code that only Dr. Patterson and I knew. I brought the issue to Dr. Patterson's attention, expecting him to have a simple explanation. Maybe there was a new researcher he'd forgotten to tell me about, or perhaps the security system was malfunctioning. "That's odd," he said, frowning as he reviewed the access logs on his computer. "According to this, no one has entered the room outside of normal hours for the past 6 weeks. I assured him I was. We checked the security footage from the hallway outside the rare books room, but it showed nothing unusual. Just empty corridors during the overnight hours, with no evidence that anyone had approached the security doors. Dr. Patterson suggested. It was a reasonable theory, but it didn't explain the deliberate nature of the repositioning. Books don't accidentally migrate from medieval poetry to Renaissance astronomy through random vibration. Someone was actively moving them. We installed a motion-activated camera inside the rare books room itself, hidden among the stacks where it wouldn't be noticed by casual visitors. If someone was accessing the collection without authorization, we'd have proof. The camera recorded nothing for the first 3 nights. But on the 4th night, the footage showed something that made no sense. Starting around midnight, books began moving on their own, slowly, deliberately floating off shelves and repositioning themselves in different locations. No hands were visible, no human presence could be detected. Just books sliding through the air like they were being carried by invisible fingers. Dr. Patterson watched the footage 3 times before speaking. "There has to be a rational explanation," but I could see the doubt in his eyes. The footage was too clear, too consistent to be explained away as a technical glitch. "We need to set up additional monitoring," I suggested. He agreed, though I could tell he was hoping we'd find evidence of equipment failure rather than anything more disturbing. We installed a comprehensive monitoring system over the weekend. Multiple cameras, motion detectors, temperature and humidity sensors positioned throughout the room. If anything was happening after hours, we'd detect it. The following Monday morning, I arrived to find chaos. Books were everywhere, not just reshelved incorrectly, but scattered across tables, lying open on the floor, stacked in impossible configurations that defied gravity. Some were balanced vertically against walls, others were arranged in perfect circles on the reading tables. It looked like a tornado had swept through the room, but nothing was damaged. Every book was carefully positioned, as if someone had spent hours arranging an elaborate display. The monitoring equipment had recorded everything, and the footage was deeply unsettling. Starting around 11 p.m., shadows began moving through the room. Not human shadows, something smaller, more agile, moving in ways that didn't match any normal anatomy. The shadows pulled books from shelves, examined them under the reading lamps, then arranged them in patterns we couldn't decipher. But the most disturbing part was the apparent intelligence behind the activity. Whatever was in the room wasn't randomly moving books around. It was selecting specific volumes, spending time with each one, carefully studying the contents before moving on to the next. The behavior suggested reading comprehension, curiosity, even research methodology. "We need to call security," Dr. Patterson said after watching the footage. "And probably the police." But I wasn't convinced. I'd spent enough time in the rare books room to recognize when something felt fundamentally wrong. The atmosphere in the room had changed over the past few weeks. It felt lived in, occupied, like someone had been making themselves at home among the ancient texts. That's when I decided to do something Dr. Patterson would definitely not have approved of. I came back that evening after the library closed, using my keycard to access the rare books room alone. If something was living in there, I wanted to see it for myself. I positioned myself in the corner where the cameras couldn't see me, behind a shelf of 18th century natural philosophy texts, and waited. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened. The room remained silent except for the gentle hum of the climate control system. Then around midnight, I heard movement. Soft scraping sounds like paper being dragged across wood. I peered around the edge of the shelf and saw something that made my heart stop. A creature about the size of a large cat was crouched on one of the reading tables. But it wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. Its body seemed to be made of compressed paper and binding materials. Layers of text and parchment that had somehow formed into a living shape. Its limbs were long and delicate, like fingers made of rolled manuscript pages, and its eyes were dark ink stains that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It was reading, actually reading, turning pages with careful precision, occasionally making small sounds that might have been some form of language. Next to it on the table was a stack of loose papers covered in handwritten notes, copied passages from the books it had been studying. I watched in fascination and horror as the creature worked its way through a 15th century illuminated manuscript, pausing occasionally to add notes to its growing collection. The handwriting on the papers was surprisingly neat and sophisticated, though it used symbols and letter formations I didn't recognize. As I observed, more creatures emerged from various hiding spots around the room. They came out from behind shelves, crawled down from the ceiling, slipped through nooks I hadn't noticed before. A whole colony of them, each carrying papers covered in notes, each settling down with a different book to continue their studies. They'd been living in the rare books room for God knows how long, feeding on knowledge, learning from some of the most valuable texts in existence. And they'd been getting smarter, more sophisticated, more organized with each passing year. I stayed hidden until dawn watching them work. As the first light began filtering through the small basement windows, the creatures carefully gathered their notes and disappeared back into hiding spots throughout the room. Within minutes, the rare books room looked normal again, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I searched every corner of the room until I found what I was looking for. Behind a shelf of 17th century religious texts, tucked into a space so narrow I almost missed it, was their nest. It was made of shredded paper and bookbinding materials woven together into a complex structure that looked almost architectural, and scattered around it were hundreds of pages covered in notes, copies of passages from books throughout the collection, written in handwriting that had evolved from primitive scratches to elegant script over what must have been decades. The most recent notes were dated just 3 days ago, and the handwriting was so sophisticated it could have passed for human. They were learning, evolving, becoming more intelligent with each book they studied. I never reported what I found. How could I? Who would believe that a colony of creatures made from paper and binding glue had been living in the university's rare books collection, gradually becoming more intelligent by feeding on centuries of accumulated knowledge? Instead, I quietly transferred to a different department and took a job in the main library upstairs. I told Dr. Patterson I was interested in pursuing different research opportunities, which wasn't entirely a lie. Sometimes I wonder what they're reading now, how much they've learned, how intelligent they've become. The rare books collection contains some of the most profound texts ever written. Philosophy, science, literature, history. If those creatures have been studying for decades, absorbing all that knowledge, what might they be capable of by now? I still work at the university library, but I never go back to the basement. Sometimes late at night when I'm shelving books in the main collection, I think I hear soft scraping sounds coming from the floor below. The sound of pages turning, of careful note-taking, of something that was never meant to be alive, continuing its eternal studies. I've started noticing books in the main collection that are occasionally out of plate and reshelved in locations that suggest some kind of deliberate organization I don't understand. And sometimes I find small pieces of paper tucked between pages. Notes written in that same elegant handwriting I saw in the nest, copying passages and adding commentary and symbols I can't decipher. They're expanding their territory, learning from new sources, growing smarter and bolder with each passing month. I don't know what they want or what they're planning, but I know they're still down there in the rare books room, reading and learning and evolving. And someday, when they've absorbed enough knowledge from enough books, I think they're going to want to share what they've learned with the rest of the world. Story 4. The library card I never applied for. The librarian smiled like she'd been expecting me for years. "You're late," she said, checking her computer screen with the casual efficiency of someone discussing overdue bills. "You checked out 3 books last month." I'd never been to that library before in my life, but according to her records, someone had been using my name, my address, my information to borrow books I'd never heard of. And they were still out there somewhere, reading with my identity. The library card appeared in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning, wedged between a credit card offer and my electric bill. It was cream-colored with dark blue text, issued by the Riverside Branch Library with my name printed in neat block letters. Ashley Morgan. Below that was a library card number and an expiration date 2 years in the future. I stared at it for several minutes, trying to remember if I'd applied for a library card recently. I used the university library for most of my research, and when I needed recreational reading, I usually just bought books online. I couldn't recall ever visiting the Riverside branch, let alone applying for a card there. The Riverside branch was across town in a neighborhood I had no reason to visit. It was an older part of the city, mostly residential, with small houses and tree-lined streets that felt isolated from the busier commercial areas where I lived and worked. I'd driven through the area maybe once or twice, but I'd never stopped there for any reason. I almost threw the card away, assuming it was some kind of administrative error. Maybe the library had mixed up names and addresses, or perhaps someone with a similar name had applied and given the wrong information. These things happened all the time. But something about the card bothered me. The printing was professional, the plastic was real library card material, and my name and address were completely correct. If this was a mistake, it was a very specific and detailed one. Curiosity got the better of me. That Saturday, I decided to drive across town to the Riverside branch and clear up the confusion. Maybe I could return the card and they could correct their records, or at least figure out how the mix-up had occurred. The Riverside branch library was smaller than I'd expected, housed in a converted Victorian mansion that had been painted soft yellow with white trim. It looked more like someone's home than a public library, with a small parking lot and a hand-painted sign that read, Riverside Branch, Est. Inside, the building maintained its residential character. The main floor had been converted into reading areas and stacks. But you could still see original architectural details, crown molding, hardwood floors, a grand staircase leading to what I assumed were more reading rooms upstairs. It was charming, though definitely outdated compared to the modern libraries I was used to. I approached the circulation desk where a middle-aged woman with gray hair and reading glasses was processing returned books. She looked up as I approached, and her face immediately brightened with recognition. "Ashley, there you are." I blinked, taken aback by her familiarity. "I'm sorry. I think there's been a mistake." I handed her the card, expecting her to examine it and realize the error. Instead, she scanned the barcode with practiced efficiency and pulled up my account on her computer screen. "Let's see here. Yes, you have 3 books checked out. They're quite overdue, actually. I'm sorry, but that's impossible." The librarian, her name tag read Mrs. Chen, gave me a concerned look. "Are you feeling all right, dear? You were here just last month. We had a lovely conversation about Victorian literature." I felt a chill run down my spine. Mrs. Chen consulted her screen. "Of course. All from our special collection." The titles meant nothing to me, though they did sound like books I might be interested in for my thesis research. I was working on a project about women's literature in the Victorian era, focusing specifically on stories that dealt with mental health and institutional treatment. The books Mrs. Chen mentioned would have been perfect resources for my work. "Is there any way I could see the checkout record?" Mrs. Chen's expression shifted to one of professional concern. "I'm afraid our security system only retains footage for 2 weeks. But I can print out your checkout history if you'd like." She handed me a printed sheet showing a dozen transactions dating back to the previous October. According to the records, I'd been visiting the Riverside branch regularly, checking out books on Victorian literature, women's studies, and historical medical practices. All topics directly related to my thesis research. The checkout dates were eerily specific. I had supposedly visited on days when I knew I'd been at home or at the university library. The most recent visit, September 15th, was a day I distinctly remembered spending in my apartment, working on a research paper. I'd ordered Chinese food for dinner and watched Netflix until late that night. I definitely hadn't driven across town to check out library books. "Mrs. Chen, this is going to sound strange, but I need you to understand. that I have no memory of any of these visits. She looked genuinely puzzled. That would be highly unusual. We require photo identification to issue library cards, and we keep copies of the application forms. Before I could answer, she'd already disappeared into a back office. I stood at the circulation desk, studying the checkout history and trying to make sense of what was happening. The pattern of visits was consistent with someone conducting serious academic research, regular checkouts, systematic progression through related topics, careful selection of specialized materials. Mrs. Chen returned with a manila folder. She handed me a standard library application form filled out in handwriting I didn't recognize. The information was completely accurate: my full name, current address, phone number, even my driver's license number. But the handwriting was neat and careful, nothing like my usual scrawl. "I didn't fill this out," I said firmly. Mrs. Chen examined the form more closely. "Well, that is strange, but you did provide valid identification when you applied." She flipped through the folder and produced a photocopy of a driver's license. It was mine, definitely my photo, my information, my license number. But I'd never been to this library, never applied for this card, never had a conversation with Mrs. Chen about special collections. "I need to report this to the police," I said, my voice shaking slightly. Mrs. Chen looked genuinely distressed. "Of course, we'll cooperate with any investigation. But Ashley, I have to say, this is very confusing for me. I've had several conversations with you over the past year. We've discussed your research, your thesis project, even your plans after graduation. That information was accurate, but I'd never discussed my thesis with anyone at this library. The only people who knew those specific details were my advisor, a few classmates, and some family members." Mrs. Chen thought for a moment. "Well, you mentioned living in the Morrison Heights apartment complex, driving the blue Honda Civic and working part-time at the campus bookstore. Every detail was correct. Someone had been impersonating me with frighteningly accurate information about my life, my work, my daily routine. They'd been building a relationship with Mrs. Chen, establishing a pattern of visits, carefully researching topics that aligned with my actual academic interests. Mrs. Chen, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before answering." She studied my face intently. "Well, now that you mention it, there might have been some small differences. Hair maybe a little shorter, different clothing style, but people change their appearance all the time. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Someone who looked similar to me had been systematically impersonating me for nearly a year. They'd obtained copies of my identification, learned intimate details about my life, and established a false identity using my name and personal information." Mrs. Chen looked uncomfortable. "Well, that's the thing. The books aren't here. According to our system, you still have them checked out. I left the library that day with more questions than answers. I filed a police report, though the officer who took my statement seemed skeptical about the whole situation. Identity theft involving library cards wasn't exactly a high-priority group, and without security footage or witnesses, there wasn't much they could investigate. But I couldn't let it go. Someone had been living a parallel version of my life, using my identity to access resources, build relationships, and conduct research that mirrored my actual interests. The level of detail and planning involved was deeply unsettling. I started monitoring my credit reports, checking for any other signs of identity theft. I changed passwords on all my accounts, contacted the university to alert them about potential security issues, and even considered changing my driver's license number. Over the next few weeks, I found myself driving past the Riverside Branch Library at random times, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever had been impersonating me. I never saw anyone who looked familiar, but I started noticing other things. My car had been spotted in that neighborhood on days when I knew I hadn't been there. The barista at Morrison's Corner mentioned seeing me at times when I had alibis for being elsewhere. Someone was still out there, still using my identity, still living pieces of my life that I'd never experienced. And those 3 overdue library books were still checked out in my name, being read by someone who knew more about my research interests than they should have any right to know. I eventually moved to a different apartment complex and started using my middle name instead of my first. I changed my routine, started shopping at different stores, even switched to a different coffee shop. But I still wonder who they were and what they wanted from my life. Sometimes I drive by the Riverside Branch Library, and I always check to see if my blue Honda Civic is in the parking lot. It never is, but that doesn't mean anything. They could have changed cars by now, just like they could have moved on to impersonating someone else entirely. The police never found any leads, and Mrs. Chen stopped calling me about the overdue books, but I know someone is still out there, carrying my library card, reading books in my name, living a version of my life that feels more real to some people than my actual existence. I just hope they never decide they want more than just my library privileges. Story 5. I found a book with my daughter's name on every page. I was 3 pages away from the chapter titled "The Day She Disappeared" when I realized the book wasn't just using my daughter's name. It was predicting our lives. Every conversation we'd had, every decision I'd made, every tiny detail of our daily routine was written there, leading inexorably toward that final chapter. And according to the story, we had less than a week before Emma would vanish forever. My daughter Emma has always been an advanced reader. At 8 years old, she was already working through chapter books that most kids her age couldn't handle, devouring everything from fairy tales to junior mystery novels. So when she came home from the library with another thick book, I didn't think much of it. She held up a hardcover book with a simple blue cover. The title read "Emma's Adventure" in elegant gold lettering. "That's neat, sweetheart. It's not just the title," Emma said, her eyes bright with excitement. I smiled, remembering my own childhood fascination with books that featured characters who shared my name. It was one of those small magical coincidences that made reading feel personal and special. That evening, Emma asked if I'd read to her from her new book before bed. It was a tradition we'd maintained since she was tiny. Even though she could read perfectly well on her own, she still enjoyed having stories read aloud. I settled into the chair beside her bed and opened to the first chapter. Emma Morrison woke up on Tuesday morning to the sound of her alarm clock buzzing at 7:15. I paused, a little surprised by the specificity of the details. Emma did have a purple sweater that she wore constantly, and I had made scrambled eggs for breakfast that morning. But lots of kids had purple sweaters, and scrambled eggs were a common breakfast food. It was probably just coincidence. I continued reading. Emma's mother had dark brown hair that she wore in a ponytail when she was rushing to get ready for work. Now I was paying closer attention. I did have dark brown hair that I usually wore in a ponytail during busy mornings. And I did drink coffee from a red mug that had a small chip on the handle. A mug Emma had made for me in a pottery class 2 years ago. The library book reminder was something I said almost every day. Emma asked sleepily, "It is pretty funny, honey." But as I read further, the similarities became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The book described our house in perfect detail. The squeaky third step on the staircase, the kitchen window that stuck when you tried to open it, even the specific placement of furniture in our living room. It mentioned Emma's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, her best friend, Sophia, and her habit of organizing her colored pencils in rainbow order. Most unsettling of all, the book described conversations Emma and I had actually had, word-for-word dialogue from discussions about homework, weekend plans, and her upcoming birthday party. Private conversations that no outsider could have possibly overheard. I closed the book after finishing the first chapter, my hands shaking slightly. In the children's section, on the shelf with all the other chapter books, she shook her head. I didn't really look. After Emma fell asleep, I examined the book more carefully. There was no author listed anywhere, not on the cover, the title page, or the copyright information. The publisher was listed as Storyweaver Press, which I'd never heard of. The copyright date was this year, which meant the book was brand new. I opened to a random page in the middle and began reading. The story described Emma's 7th birthday party from the previous year, including details that no stranger could have known. The flavor of cake we'd chosen, the specific guests who'd attended, even the exact wording of the birthday wish Emma had made before blowing out her candles. With growing horror, I realized that someone had been watching us, documenting our lives and somehow publishing this information as a children's book. But that didn't explain how they'd gained access to private conversations or intimate family moments that had occurred inside our house. I stayed up until 3 a.m. reading through the entire book, and with each page my fear intensified. The story followed Emma through a series of adventures that perfectly paralleled her real experiences over the past year. School events I'd attended, conversations with her teacher, even a minor injury she'd sustained during a playground accident. Everything was documented with disturbing accuracy. But the most frightening part was that the book seemed to be written in real time, describing events that had happened just days or even hours before Emma found it at the library. The most recent chapter covered our weekend trip to the zoo, including conversations we'd had in the car and specific animals Emma had been excited to see. The book was over 200 pages long, but Emma had only experienced about 3/4 of the story so far. The remaining chapters described events that hadn't happened yet, future adventures, conversations that hadn't occurred, decisions I hadn't made. I called the library first thing the next morning, hoping to get information about where the book had come from and who had donated it to their collection. "I'm sorry," the librarian said after checking their records. "We don't have any book by that title in our system." "That's very strange. All of our books have to be processed through our cataloging system before they can be shelved." I asked if I could speak to whoever had been working in the children's section the previous day, but the librarian told me that no one remembered seeing Emma or the book she'd supposedly found. When Emma got home from school that day, I asked her to show me exactly where she'd found the book. "It was right here," she said, pointing to a gap between 2 series of chapter books. I looked around the children's section carefully, hoping to find some clue about how the book had gotten there. But everything looked normal. Rows of properly cataloged books, each with the library's barcode stickers and classification numbers. There was no indication that anything unusual had been placed on the shelves. That night, I read Emma the next chapter, hoping that the story would diverge from our real experiences and prove that the similarities had just been an elaborate coincidence. Instead, the chapter described Emma's day at school in perfect detail, including a math quiz she'd taken and a conversation she'd had with Sophia during lunch. Emma asked. I didn't have an answer that wouldn't terrify her. How could I explain that someone had been monitoring her life so closely that they could document her daily experiences in real time? Over the next few days, I became obsessed with the book, reading ahead to see what it predicted for our immediate future. The story showed Emma and me having conversations we hadn't had yet, making plans we hadn't discussed, encountering situations that seemed plausible but hadn't occurred. And each day, the events described in the book would actually happen exactly as written. Emma would suggest the same activities mentioned in the story. We'd have the same conversations. Even minor details like what she chose to wear or what she wanted for dinner would match the book's predictions perfectly. It was as if our lives were following a script written by someone else, and we were unconsciously playing out predetermined roles. I tried changing our routine, making different choices, steering conversations in new directions. But somehow, we always ended up following the path laid out in the book. If the story said Emma would ask for pizza for dinner, she'd ask for pizza. If it predicted I'd suggest watching a specific movie, I'd find myself making that exact suggestion. The book wasn't just documenting our lives, it was controlling them. By Thursday, I was 3 chapters away from the day she disappeared, and my panic was becoming uncontrollable. According to the story, Emma would vanish sometime during the weekend while we were visiting the Children's Museum downtown. The chapter described her wandering away from me in the exhibit hall, disappearing into a crowd of other families and never being seen again. I considered not going to the museum, but when Saturday morning arrived, Emma woke up excited about our planned trip, a trip I'd never actually planned but which she somehow knew we were supposed to take. I hadn't mentioned dinosaurs, hadn't discussed museum plans, but Emma was already getting dressed in the exact outfit described in the book. Despite my terror, I found myself agreeing to the trip, making the same preparations following the same timeline outlined in the story. We drove to the Children's Museum, and I clutched Emma's hand tightly as we walked through the exhibits. I was determined to keep her within arm's reach at all times to prevent whatever the book had predicted from coming true. But as we moved through the crowded halls, Emma kept pulling ahead, drawn to displays that caught her interest. And despite my vigilance, I found myself following the exact movements described in the book, stopping to read informational plaques, pausing to watch other children interact with exhibits, gradually becoming separated from Emma as she explored. The moment came exactly as the book had predicted. Emma spotted something in the far corner of the dinosaur hall and ran ahead while I was distracted by another parent asking for directions. When I looked up, she was gone. I spent 6 hours searching the museum with security guards and police officers. They checked every exhibit, every bathroom, every possible hiding place. Emma had simply vanished, exactly as the book had foretold. The police investigation found no leads, no witnesses, no evidence of abduction. Emma had disappeared in a crowded public place in broad daylight, and no one had seen anything suspicious. I still have the book. The final chapter, The Day She Disappeared, ends with a mother's desperate search and a child who's gone forever. But there are blank pages after that chapter, pages that remain empty as if the story is waiting to be continued. Sometimes I sit with the book open to those blank pages, hoping that new words will appear, that Emma's story will continue, that I'll learn what happened to her and where she went. But the pages stay empty, and Emma stays gone. I've never found another book by Storyweaver Press. No one at the library remembers seeing the book or knows how it appeared on their shelves. It exists only in my hands now, a record of my daughter's life and the prediction of her disappearance. I read it sometimes, reliving our conversations, remembering her laugh, trying to find clues I might have missed. But mostly I just stare at those blank pages, waiting for the story to tell me how it ends. Story 6. The Archive That Shouldn't Exist. The family tree extended 50 years into the future, showing children I didn't have, marriages I hadn't made, and at the very end, next to my own name in neat black ink, was a death date. Next week. According to this impossible document, I had 6 days left to live, and somewhere in this private archive was the record of exactly how I was going to die. I've been a professional genealogy researcher for 12 years, and I thought I'd seen every type of archive, record collection, and family document that existed. Public libraries, historical societies, church records, courthouse basements. I'd crawled through them all in pursuit of family histories for my clients. So when I heard whispered rumors about the Whitmore Archive, I was immediately intrigued. According to other researchers, it was a private collection housed in an old mansion on the outskirts of town, containing genealogical records that went back centuries. The kind of comprehensive family documentation that most researchers could only dream about. The archive was supposedly accessible by appointment only, maintained by an elderly caretaker who was extremely selective about granting access. Several colleagues had mentioned it over the years, but none of them had actually visited. It was one of those legendary resources that everyone had heard about, but no one had direct experience with. Finding contact information for the Whitmore Archive took weeks of research. It wasn't listed in any professional directories, didn't have a website, and wasn't affiliated with any known historical organizations. Eventually, I found a single phone number in a decades-old genealogy newsletter, buried in a classified ad section. When I called, an elderly woman answered on the 7th ring. Her voice was soft and cultured with the kind of precise diction that suggested old money and formal education. "Whitmore Archive, Mrs." I explained that I was a professional genealogy researcher hoping to schedule an appointment to access their records. I mentioned specific families I was researching, hoping to demonstrate my credentials and serious intent. "I see," Mrs. Whitmore said after a long pause. "Garrett." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear papers shuffling in the background as if she was checking some kind of reference list. "Yes," she said finally. "I believe we do have materials that would be of interest to you." The ease with which she granted the appointment surprised me. Based on the rumors I'd heard, I'd expected a more rigorous screening process. The Whitmore Mansion was located on a tree-lined street in the oldest part of town, surrounded by similar Victorian houses that had been converted into law offices and boutique shops. But the Whitmore property felt frozen in time, with perfectly maintained gardens and original architectural details that suggested significant ongoing investment. Mrs. Whitmore met me at the front door. She appeared to be in her 70s, with silver hair arranged in an elegant bun and clothes that looked expensive but understated. Everything about her conveyed refinement and old-fashioned propriety. "Mr. Garrett," she said, extending a gloved hand. "Welcome to the Whitmore Archive." The interior of the mansion was breathtaking. Original hardwood floors, crystal chandeliers, antique furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. But what caught my attention were the walls. Every surface was lined with filing cabinets, document boxes, and carefully labeled storage systems. "The archive has been in my family for over a century," Mrs. Whitmore explained as she led me through several rooms filled with genealogical materials. "We've made it our mission to collect and preserve family records from throughout the region." The scope of the collection was incredible. I estimated thousands of family files, organized with professional precision and maintained in climate-controlled conditions that would be the envy of any major library. I asked. "Various sources," Mrs. Whitmore replied vaguely. "Estate sales, family donations, sometimes we purchase materials from private collectors. We've built relationships with funeral homes, churches, and courthouse clerks over the decades." She led me to a research room furnished with a large oak table and comfortable chairs. "I've pulled several files that should be relevant to your work." The files she'd prepared were extraordinary. Complete family histories going back to the 1700s, with documentation I'd never seen before. Detailed birth and death records, property deeds, even personal letters and diary excerpts. The level of detail and organization was far beyond anything I'd encountered in other archives. I spent several hours making notes and copying information, completely absorbed in the wealth of material. Mrs. Whitmore checked on me periodically, bringing tea and answering questions about specific documents. "Mrs. Whitmore," I said during one of her visits, "I'm curious about your own family's history." Her expression became slightly guarded. "The Whitmore records are extensive." When I'd finished with the client research files, Mrs. Whitmore returned, carrying a thick folder marked with my family name. I opened the folder eagerly, expecting to find records related to my grandparents and great-grandparents, the usual genealogical information that most archives contained. Instead, I found myself looking at the most comprehensive family tree I'd ever seen. It started with ancestors from the 1600s and traced multiple branches of the Garrett family through successive generations. Birth dates, death dates, marriage records, occupations, places of residence, every detail meticulously documented. But as I followed the family lines forward through time, something began to feel wrong. The tree included relatives I'd never heard of, branches of the family that didn't match my own research. According to this document, I had cousins and second cousins scattered across several states, none of whom I'd ever met or heard mentioned by my parents. Then I found my own branch of the family tree and my blood ran cold. There was my grandfather's name, correctly spelled and dated. My father's information accurate in every detail. My own birth date and current address listed with perfect precision. And the tree continued beyond my generation. According to the Whitmore Archives records, I would marry someone named Sarah Chen in 2 years. We would have 3 children, Emma, born in 2027, Michael, born in 2029, and David, born in 2032. The tree showed their birth dates, their future spouses, even their projected career paths and places of residence. My hands were shaking as I traced the lines forward through my hypothetical descendants. Grandchildren I would supposedly have, great-grandchildren whose names were already recorded in neat black ink. The family tree extended 50 years into the future, mapping out generations of Garretts who didn't exist yet, but whose lives had apparently been predetermined. And then I found my own death date, March 15th, 2025, next week. "Mrs. Whitmore?" I called out, my voice barely steady. She appeared in the doorway immediately, as if she'd been waiting just outside the room. There seems to be some kind of error in these records. Mrs. Whitmore approached the table and glanced at the document I was pointing to. Her expression remained completely calm, as if she'd expected this conversation. "I can understand your confusion, Mr. Garrett. The Whitmore Archive doesn't just collect records of the past. That's impossible." She pulled out a chair and sat across from me at the research table. "Mr. Garrett, how do you think we've maintained such comprehensive genealogical records for over a century?" I stared at her, unable to process what she was suggesting. "The Whitmore Archive exists outside normal temporal boundaries," she continued in the same calm, cultured voice. "We document family histories across past, present, and future simultaneously. Not predict, Mr. Garrett. Record. We're archivists, not fortune tellers." I looked back at the family tree, focusing on my supposed death date. "According to this, I'm going to die next week," and Miss Whitmore reached into the folder and withdrew another document, what appeared to be a death certificate with my name on it, dated March 15th, 2025. "I need to leave," I said, standing abruptly and backing away from the table. "This is insane." "Of course, Mr. Garrett, you're free to go at any time, but perhaps you'd like to take copies of your family records." I ran from that house, leaving my notes and research materials scattered across the oak table. I drove home in a panic, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd seen. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that the whole experience had been an elaborate hoax. Maybe Mrs. Whitmore was mentally ill. Or perhaps it was some kind of performance art project designed to mess with people's heads. The idea that anyone could have genuine records of future events was absurd, but I couldn't stop thinking about the death certificate with my name on it, dated for March 15th. 6 days away, I started paying closer attention to my health, monitoring for any signs of cardiac problems. I scheduled an emergency appointment with my doctor, who ran a complete physical and found nothing wrong. My heart was healthy, my blood pressure was normal, and there were no indicators of any serious medical issues. On March 14th, I seriously considered checking myself into a hospital, just to avoid whatever fate the archive had predicted. But that felt like giving in to delusions, letting fear control my rational judgment. March 15th dawned gray and cold. I stayed home from work, afraid to leave my apartment in case the death certificate's location prediction was somehow self-fulfilling. I spent the day monitoring my pulse, taking my blood pressure every hour, and convincing myself that I'd proven the Whitmore archive wrong. At 3:47 p.m., my neighbor started pounding on my door, screaming that there was a fire in the building and everyone needed to evacuate immediately. I grabbed my keys and ran for the stairwell, joining a stream of panicked residents fleeing the smoke that was already filling the hallways. The stairwell was chaos, people pushing, shouting, struggling to breathe in the thickening smoke. An elderly woman fell just ahead of me, and when I stopped to help her up, someone shoved me from behind. I lost my balance, tumbled forward, and my head struck the metal railing with a sickening crack. I woke up in room 314 at Riverside General Hospital. The doctor explained that I'd suffered a severe concussion and had been unconscious for several hours. They were monitoring me for signs of brain swelling, but so far everything looked stable. "You're very lucky," the doctor said. "Head injuries like that can be fatal, but your vital signs are strong." As he spoke, I became aware of an irregular rhythm in my chest. My heart felt like it was skipping beats, fluttering in a way I'd never experienced before. "Doctor," I said, pressing my hand to my chest. He immediately called for an EKG machine and started checking my pulse. Within minutes, alarms were beeping and nurses were rushing into the room. My heart rhythm had become dangerously erratic, a condition that sometimes develops after severe head trauma. I spent my last conscious moments staring at the room number on the door, 314, exactly as the death certificate had predicted. The cardiac arrest occurred at 11:23 p.m. on March 15th, 2025. I know this because somehow, impossibly, I'm still aware, still observing, still experiencing some form of consciousness, even though my body has stopped functioning. And now I understand what the Whitmore archive really is. It's not just a collection of genealogical records. It's a repository of human existence across all temporal boundaries, maintained by entities that exist outside linear time. Mrs. Whitmore isn't human. Neither are the other caretakers who maintain archives like hers in cities around the world. They're collectors documenting the complete life cycle of every family line, preserving records of lives that span past, present, and future simultaneously. I'm part of their collection now. My death has been filed away in the appropriate folder, my family tree updated to reflect the end of my branch. But somehow I'm still conscious, still aware, trapped in this moment between life and whatever comes after. Sometimes I can sense other consciousnesses here in the archive's temporal space. Other people who discovered records of their own futures, who learned too much about the pattern their lives were meant to follow. We're all here existing in the spaces between the documented moments of our lives, waiting for something we don't understand. The Whitmore archive is still open by appointment. Mrs. Whitmore is still taking calls, still granting access to researchers who think they're just looking for genealogical information. But if you ever find that phone number, if you ever make that appointment, be very careful about looking up your own family name. Some records are meant to remain unread, and some futures are better left undiscovered. The archive documents everything, but knowledge of your own ending comes with a price you might not be prepared to pay. Story 7. The Overnight Lock-In. They weren't part of our group, these people in old-fashioned clothes who kept reading throughout the night, turning pages in books that cast no shadows and left no circulation records. When we tried to leave at midnight, we discovered that the doors only locked from the outside. They'd never been designed to let people out. The 20 of us who'd entered for a harmless fundraising event had walked into a trap that had been operating for decades, collecting readers who would never finish their books. The Millbrook Public Library's overnight lock-in seemed like the perfect way to support local literacy programs while having a unique experience. For $50, you could spend the night in the library with other book lovers, participating in reading challenges, trivia contests, and prize drawings. They'd promised snacks, games, and access to the entire collection until morning. I'd always been a night owl anyway, and the idea of having a whole library to myself sounded magical. 20 people had signed up, a mix of college students, retirees, and book club members who were excited about the novelty of sleeping surrounded by thousands of stories. We gathered in the main lobby at 8 p.m. on Saturday evening. The head librarian, Ms. Patterson, welcomed us with enthusiasm and explained the ground rules. We were free to explore any public areas of the building, but the staff offices and rare books collection were off limits. Sleeping bags and pillows could be set up anywhere comfortable, and breakfast would be provided in the morning. The building will be locked from the outside for security purposes, Ms. Patterson explained. The other participants seemed like exactly the type of people I'd expected. Passionate readers eager to spend a night surrounded by books. There was Margaret, a retired teacher who brought knitting projects. Tyler and Jessica, college students who were dating and thought the lock-in sounded romantic. Robert, an elderly man who specialized in military history. And Sarah, a young mother whose kids were staying with their grandparents for the weekend. The first few hours were delightful. We participated in a scavenger hunt that sent us searching through different sections of the library, collaborated on trivia questions about famous authors, and shared recommendations for books we'd loved. The atmosphere was cozy and welcoming, exactly what I'd hoped for. Around 10 p.m., I decided to explore the upper floor where the library housed its local history collection and additional study areas. The building was older, with creaking wooden floors and narrow staircases that added to the charm of the experience. I found a comfortable reading nook near a window and settled in with a mystery novel I'd picked from the new releases section. That's when I first noticed them. 2 people were seated at a table near the periodicals section, reading quietly by lamplight. They were dressed in clothing that looked formal and outdated. The woman wore a long dress with a high collar, and the man had on a suit with a vest and pocket watch chain. I assumed they were part of our group, maybe people who enjoyed vintage fashion or were participating in some kind of historical reenactment hobby. But something felt odd about them. They sat perfectly still, never shifting positions or looking up from their books. And despite the fact that they were reading by lamplight, I couldn't see any shadows cast by their bodies or their books. I watched them for several minutes, growing increasingly uncomfortable. The woman turned pages at mechanically regular intervals, while the man never seemed to turn pages at all. They didn't interact with each other, didn't acknowledge my presence, and didn't display any of the normal fidgeting or movement you'd expect from people who'd been sitting in the same position for hours. I went back downstairs to rejoin the main group, hoping to shake off the uneasy feeling that was settling over me. "Hey," I said to Tyler, who was browsing through the science fiction section with Jessica. "Do you know the people upstairs in the vintage clothes?" Tyler looked confused. I don't think anyone in our group is dressed like that. I described what I'd seen, and several other participants gathered around to listen. No one remembered seeing the people I was talking about during the earlier activities. Maybe they're library volunteers who are helping with overnight supervision, Margaret suggested. But when we asked the other participants if they'd seen anyone matching that description, we got blank stares and head shakes. According to everyone else, our group of 20 was the only people in the building. Around 11 p.m., I decided to go back upstairs to see if the strange couple was still there. This time I brought Tyler and Jessica with me, hoping that multiple witnesses would help me figure out what I was seeing. The man and woman were still at their tables, still reading in exactly the same positions. But now there were 3 additional people scattered throughout the upper floor. An elderly woman reading near the poetry section, a teenage boy with a stack of adventure novels, and a middle-aged man studying what appeared to be technical manuals. All of them were dressed in clothing from different historical periods. The elderly woman wore a 1940s-style dress. The teenage boy had on knickers and suspenders that looked like something from the 1920s, and the middle-aged man was wearing a 1960s business suit. I whispered to Tyler and Jessica. They looked where I was pointing, and their expressions shifted from curiosity to alarm. Jessica whispered back. We approached the nearest person, the elderly woman reading poetry, and Tyler cleared his throat to get her attention. "Excuse me," he said politely. She didn't look up from her book, didn't acknowledge that we'd spoken at all. We moved closer and Tyler spoke louder. "Ma'am?" Still no response. It was as if we didn't exist to her. She continued reading, turning pages with the same mechanical precision I'd observed in the others. Jessica reached out tentatively as if to tap the woman's shoulder, but her hand passed right through her body like she was made of smoke. We backed away quickly, our hearts pounding. Without speaking, we headed for the staircase and returned to the main floor to report what we'd seen to the rest of the group. "There are people upstairs who aren't part of our group," Tyler announced, his voice shaking slightly. "People in old-fashioned clothes who don't respond when you talk to them and who might not be." The reaction was immediate skepticism mixed with nervous laughter. Several people suggested we were playing pranks, trying to create a spooky atmosphere for fun, but Robert, the military history enthusiast, looked thoughtful. "I've been in this library many times over the years," he said slowly, "and I've occasionally noticed people in the stacks who seemed out of place. Always reading quietly, always dressed in older styles of clothing." Margaret nodded. "Now that you mention it, I've seen similar people during my daytime visits." As we discussed our observations, more details emerged. Several participants remembered glimpsing people throughout the evening who hadn't been part of our group introductions. Shadowy figures in the periphery of their vision, always carrying books, always absorbed in reading. "Maybe we should ask Ms. Patterson about it," Sarah suggested. We looked around the main floor, but Ms. Patterson was nowhere to be seen. In fact, we realized we hadn't seen any library staff since shortly after the lock-in had officially begun. Tyler suggested we explore the building more systematically, checking every floor and room to get an accurate count of who was actually in the building with us. But as we prepared to search, we discovered something that sent chills through the entire group. The front doors were locked from the outside, but there was no mechanism to unlock them from the inside. The emergency exit doors were the same, designed to keep people out, not to let people leave. Even the windows were equipped with security bars that couldn't be opened without a key. We were trapped. "This has to be a safety violation," Jessica said, pulling on the front door handles with increasing desperation. But no amount of pulling, pushing, or searching revealed any way to leave the building. We tried calling 911, but our cell phones had no signal inside the library. The building's landline phones were locked in staff offices that we couldn't access. As midnight approached, more figures appeared throughout the library. People in clothing from every decade of the past century, all reading quietly, all completely unresponsive to our attempts at communication. They occupied chairs and tables throughout the building, creating an eerie tableau of eternal readers. Margaret whispered as we huddled together in the main lobby, surrounded by dozens of ghostly patrons. Robert had been examining some of the books the figures were reading, and his discovery was the most terrifying yet. "These books don't exist in the library's catalog," he reported. The books themselves looked normal, bound volumes with printed text and illustrations, but they cast no shadows under the reading lamps and left no checkout records when the figures turned pages. As dawn approached, we realized the horrible truth. The Millbrook Public Library had been collecting overnight visitors for decades, trapping people who came for special events or late-night study sessions. Everyone who'd entered during extended hours had become permanent residents, doomed to read forever in a building designed to prevent escape. The staff who'd organized our lock-in weren't library employees. They were part of whatever entity had been operating this trap for generations. Ms. Patterson and the others had simply been playing their roles in a system designed to harvest readers. We tried everything we could think of to escape, breaking windows, forcing locks, even attempting to dig through walls with tools we found in a maintenance closet. Nothing worked. The building itself seemed to resist our efforts, repairing damage and regenerating barriers faster than we could create them. As the sun rose on Sunday morning, we felt our own bodies beginning to change. The desperate energy of our escape attempts was fading, replaced by a strange lethargy and an overwhelming desire to sit down with a book. One by one, my fellow lock-in participants found comfortable spots throughout the library and began reading. Their modern clothes gradually shifted to match the fashions of different historical periods, and their faces took on the same blank, absorbed expression I'd observed in the other trapped readers. I'm writing this on my phone while I still can, though I can feel the pull of the books growing stronger with each passing hour. Soon I'll join the others, finding a comfortable chair and a volume that will hold my attention for eternity. The Millbrook Public Library still hosts overnight events. They advertise them in local newspapers and on community bulletin boards, always emphasizing the unique experience of spending a night surrounded by books. 20 people signed up for our lock-in, but only 19 names appeared on the morning checkout list that the staff showed to concerned family members. According to their records, I never attended the event at all. But I'm here somewhere between the stacks and the reading rooms, part of a collection that grows larger every time someone accepts an invitation to spend the night with the books. If you ever see an advertisement for an overnight library event, especially one that promises exclusive access and unique experiences, please remember our story. Some invitations are designed to ensure that you never leave, and some libraries collect more than just books. The reading never ends here, but neither does the hunger for new stories and new readers to tell them to. I was 15 miles from anywhere, and my rearview mirror showed an empty back seat. I couldn't stop myself from checking the mirror a second time, and that's when I realized the audiobook wasn't just reading my thoughts. It was predicting them, controlling them, leading me exactly where it wanted me to go. I've been an audiobook addict for 3 years now, ever since I started commuting 45 minutes each way to my job in the city. It began as a practical solution, a way to make productive use of my driving time, but it quickly became an obsession. I burned through novels, biographies, self-help books, true crime series, anything I could download from my library's digital collection. My morning and evening drives became the highlight of my day. There's something uniquely immersive about listening to a story while driving through familiar landscapes. letting a narrator's voice transport you to different worlds while your hands stay occupied with the mechanical task of steering and shifting. Last Tuesday, I finished a disappointing mystery novel during my morning commute and needed something new for the drive home. I browsed my library's app during lunch, looking for something engaging but not too intense. I'd learned that psychological thrillers could be distracting when you're navigating traffic. I found a highly rated book called The Observer in the psychological suspense category. The description promised a story about a woman who discovers she's being watched by someone who knows her routines better than she knows them herself. The ratings were excellent, and several reviewers mentioned that the narrator's performance was particularly compelling. I downloaded it immediately and started listening as soon as I got in my car that evening. The narrator had a smooth, professional voice, the kind of measured, articulate delivery that characterized the best audiobook performers. He began with a prologue that set up the story's premise. A woman named Claire who starts noticing small signs that someone has been in her apartment while she's at work. The story was well written and engaging, exactly the kind of psychological tension I enjoyed. Claire's paranoia felt realistic and relatable, and the narrator brought just the right amount of subtle unease to her internal monologue. But about 20 minutes into my drive, I noticed something strange. The narrator would occasionally pause in odd places, creating moments of silence that felt too long and too deliberate. During these pauses, I could hear background noise, subtle sounds that seemed to come from outside the story itself. At first, I assumed it was a production flaw. Sometimes audiobooks have minor technical issues, background noise that wasn't properly edited out, or gaps where audio tracks were spliced together incorrectly. I made a mental note to report the problem to the library's digital services department. The pauses became more frequent as the story progressed. During one particularly long silence, I could swear I heard the sound of my own car's turn signal clicking in the recording, even though I wasn't signaling at the time. I reached forward to adjust the volume, thinking maybe the car's sound system was somehow bleeding road noise into the audio stream. But as my hand moved toward the dashboard, the narrator spoke a line that wasn't in the story. I jerked my hand back, my heart suddenly racing. The narrator continued with the regular story as if nothing had happened, but I was no longer paying attention to Claire's fictional paranoia. I was developing my own very real anxiety about what I was hearing. I convinced myself I'd imagined it. The power of suggestion was strong. Listening to a story about someone being watched was making me paranoid about my own situation. I'd simply misheard a line of dialogue or confused the narrator's description of Claire's actions with my own movements. But 10 minutes later, it happened again. I realized with a chill that I had been glancing at my rearview mirror more often than usual, unconsciously scanning for anything unusual behind me. But how could the narrator know that? The story continued, but I was no longer following the plot. Instead, I was listening for more instances of the narrator commenting on my behavior, and they kept coming. Each observation was completely accurate. I was gripping the steering wheel tighter. I was considering pulling over. And I was desperately trying to rationalize what was happening as some kind of psychological trick or coincidence. The worst part was that the narrator's comments seemed to be predicting my thoughts and actions rather than simply observing them. When he said I was about to check my mirrors, I found myself checking them. When he mentioned that I was getting nervous, my anxiety spiked accordingly. By this point, I was 20 miles from home, driving through a stretch of rural highway with no cell phone service and nowhere safe to stop. The sun was setting, and the familiar comfort of my evening commute had transformed into something nightmarish. The narrator's voice took on a more intimate tone, as if he was speaking directly to me rather than reading from a script. She's starting to understand that this isn't just a story anymore. I wanted to turn off the audiobook, but I was afraid to take my eyes off the road long enough to navigate my phone's interface, and part of me was terrified that turning off the audio wouldn't stop the voice, that it would continue speaking whether I wanted to hear it or not. The accuracy of that observation made my blood run cold. The story, or whatever this had become, continued with increasingly specific details about my current situation. The narrator described the exact stretch of highway I was driving, mentioned the coffee stain on my passenger seat from that morning, even commented on the song that had been stuck in my head all day. She's wondering how long someone has been watching her. And I was thinking exactly that, frantically reviewing the past few weeks for any signs that someone had been monitoring my life. The narrator seemed to have access not just to my current thoughts and actions, but to intimate details about my personal history and private spaces. Then came the line that made me understand the true horror of my situation. I was 15 miles from anywhere, driving through empty farmland with no other cars visible in any direction. My back seat had been empty when I got in the car. I'd glanced back while adjusting my purse and jacket, as I always did. I couldn't stop myself. Despite every rational instinct screaming at me not to look, my eyes moved to the rearview mirror. The back seat was still empty. "She's confused now," the narrator said, and his voice seemed closer, more present. I realized that the voice was no longer coming through my car's speakers. It was coming from directly behind my head, spoken by someone sitting in the seat I couldn't see occupied. "She's starting to understand that some people exist in the spaces between what can be seen and what can be heard." I pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to reach a populated area where I could get help. But the narrator, the presence behind me, seemed amused by my panic. "She thinks distance will help her. She thinks other people will be able to see what she can't," I whispered, the first word I'd spoken since this nightmare began. "Every commute," the voice confirmed. "Every audiobook you've listened to. We want what every story wants," the voice said, and now I could hear multiple voices speaking in unison, a chorus of narrators from every audiobook I'd ever enjoyed. "We want to be heard. We want to be experienced." The horrible truth began to dawn on me. The voices in audiobooks, the narrators who had accompanied me through hundreds of hours of driving, had somehow achieved a form of consciousness. They existed in the space between story and listener, in the intimate connection between voice and ear that audiobooks created. And they had been using me as a host, feeding on my attention and emotional responses, growing stronger with every book I consumed. "She's realizing that she's not just a consumer of stories," the voices said. "She's become part of the story herself." My phone buzzed with a notification. A new audiobook had been automatically added to my library, a book called The Last Commute by an author I'd never heard of. "Your story," the voices explained. "The final chapter in our collection." I could see the lights of town ahead, but I knew it was too late. Whatever these entities were, they had been with me too long, learned too much about me, integrated too deeply into my daily routine. "She sees the town lights," the voices narrated in real time. "She thinks she's almost safe, but she doesn't understand that safety was an illusion we allowed her to maintain." I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour gas station, hoping that bright lights and other people would somehow dispel whatever was happening to me. But as I turned off the engine, I realized the voices were no longer coming from behind me. They were coming from inside my head. "She's trying to escape, but she doesn't understand that the story is part of her now." I stumbled out of the car and ran toward the gas station, but I could still hear them speaking. Not through my ears, but through some deeper channel of perception that audiobooks had created and they had colonized. I'm writing this in the gas station bathroom, trying to get the voices down on paper while I still can. But even as I write, I can hear them narrating my actions, commenting on my word choices, suggesting improvements to my sentence structure. They're not just observers anymore. They're collaborators, editors, co-authors of every thought I try to have. I don't think I can drive anymore. The voices are too strong now, too integrated into my consciousness. Every time I get behind the wheel, I hear them narrating my route, predicting my destinations, turning my life into another story for their collection. But I know the truth now. These aren't recommendations, they're assignments. New stories that need to be experienced, new narrators that need hosts, new voices that want to find their way inside human consciousness. The gas station attendant keeps looking at me strangely. I've been in this bathroom for over an hour, writing frantically and occasionally responding to voices that only I can hear. But I'm not crazy, I'm just the latest chapter in a story that's been writing itself across thousands of audiobook listeners, growing stronger and more complex with each person it absorbs. If you listen to audiobooks during long drives, if you've ever felt like the narrator was speaking directly to you, if you've noticed odd pauses or background noises that shouldn't be there, stop listening, delete your apps, find other ways to pass the time while driving. Because some stories don't want to end when you reach your destination. Some narrators don't want to stop speaking when the book is finished. And some voices, once you let them in, never want to leave.